Good morning. We have Bob McCoy with us this morning, and he's head of the Abortion Referral Agency. And this is just the beginning of a 2 or 3 day program. And you should have gotten the agenda in your PO, so check, and we're having more things today and tomorrow. And this is Bob McCoy. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry I'm tardy. There were 16 automobiles banged up on 35W North. So you all ought to be glad you're sitting here instead of out trying to push your car off the fence and so forth of what's going on. I was here to talk about women's rights, and particularly women's rights regarding aspects of birth control, abortion, and sterilization. And I think it's important that this is an issue that many young people are concerned with, and older people also. I'm the founder of the committee that's trying to change the law in Minnesota, the Minnesota Council for the Legal Termination of Pregnancy, which just 2 weeks ago changed its name to Moral. Minnesotans organized to repeal abortion laws. That's much easier to remember. So let me begin and discuss with you what I think some of the issues are dealing with abortion law reform. But before I do, I'll share with you some of the more humorous things that have occurred recently dealing with the desire of many people to object and protest and retain the present law. One of the advantages of having a clipping service is that I get such clippings like from the Fairmount Daily Sentinel, which recently sent me this clipping, in which the writer thought that she was encouraged by the number of people that are opposing abortion laws. She said what she thinks that the worst problem today is the breakdown of moral and spiritual values. We need more education on lust control instead of making birth control available. So this young lady in Bingham Lake, Minnesota, urges lust control, whatever that might be. Then one nice thing of having your name in the paper occasionally is to have somebody in Buffalo, Minnesota, write you such a nice postcard as this. He doesn't sign his name, but I bet he must be 95 years old. It says, "To Robert McCoy, promoter of abortions and for low-down, godless, sex-crazy women. To make them mate like with any Tom, Dick, or Harry like the female dog that is in heat." Wouldn't it make, goes on talking about these sex-crazy, godless women running around, and then he signs him the proud father of 11 children. Who's the sex-crazy person involved here? The interesting thing received in the mail recently is from the Voice for the Unconceived. There is an organization called the Voice of the Unconceived, and it says, "With all this talk about population control, the unconceived have little chance to be heard. Because they cannot speak for themselves, we should try to speak for them. No so-called civil liberty should allow humans already born to snuff out the lives of the unconceived. Every child has the right to be conceived." And then apparently they're in their newsletter pointing out that someone who had read a previous newsletter wrote in and complained because the woman had spelt the word prophylactic wrong. And they say in their newsletter, "For those who don't know, Rhoda, who was objected to because she had misspelled prophylactic, is 82 years old, and we are very proud of the job that she is doing." Then it tells about Dr. McClintock visiting over 50 drugstores, urging the managers to stop selling contraceptives over the counter. And as they say, why is there an organization to protect the unconceived? They say, why do we have the right to decide who should be conceived? No. There is talk of so-called population problem, but this is evasive. There are many pressing problems in the world today, but there is also a shortage of people to solve these problems. We must let our future scientists and statesmen be conceived if we are to benefit from their talents. In other words, they think that some future Beethoven or Einstein are in the wings waiting to be conceived. I submit that also a future Genghis Khan and Adolf Hitler may also be in the wings waiting to be conceived. But to bring it down to more practical terms, let's look a bit to see who are on the side of those who wish to control the sexual behavior in male and women, and particularly women, regarding population and fertility. Many of you have seen that the John Birch Society is very active in the campaign to restore human decency to young people. There's an organization called the Movement to Restore Decency, a wing of the John Birch Society, which held a $2 donation program at the Knights of Columbus Hall in Crystal, Minnesota a few months ago, in which Colonel Jack Moore talked about people control. The government's war on life must be stopped. But to bring it down, to be a little more precise, let me talk about what the present law is and what people are trying to do to change it or to retain it. The present law in Minnesota was enacted in 1873 dealing with abortion. It is a law that simply says that any woman may not seek an abortion, nor may any person perform an abortion, unless the same is necessary to preserve her life. The present law in Minnesota provides a punishment for a woman seeking an abortion with a greater penalty than a person performing one. It's interesting that when Dr. Hodgson's case was presented to our state Supreme Court last month, that the second case they heard was of Mr. Hultgren. Mr. Hultgren owns a dry cleaning shop at 31st and Lindale. He had been doing abortions back on the dry cleaning table, after hours, of course, sterilizing his instruments on his gas stove. He did an abortion on a co-ed from St. Cloud State College earlier last year, in which she got a severe infection, and she complained to the police, and he was arrested and given a 4-year prison sentence, which is fine. But he pointed out that the present law doesn't say that only doctors can do abortions, and he claimed that he was preserving the life of this young lady from St. Cloud. And so he appealed his conviction. But it was important, I think, for the justices to see the comparison between a physician, Dr. Hodgson, the only physician in the Western Hemisphere ever being convicted of an abortion performed in a hospital, as contrasted to the dry cleaner, Mr. Hultgren. And we hope this punctuates to the justices that even though laws in 19 states have changed, women in this state are still going to amateur abortionists to get medical care. And looking at one of the justices with his green eye shade and rubber binders on his sleeves, I do not feel that we will have an enlightened, judicial, courageous decision in Minnesota. I may be wrong, and I hope I'm terribly mistaken. But how did Minnesota get this law on the books? I'd like to review for you just a bit what some of the history of the anti-abortion laws are. The first law dealing with medical care and the statutes is really a law that was enacted in 1821 in New York State. And it says that every person who shall perform any surgical procedure by which human life shall be destroyed or endangered, such as the amputation of a limb or of the breast or of cutting of the stone or for hernia, unless it is necessary to preserve that person's life, then he shall be judged guilty of a misdemeanor. This bill was drafted in New York State, and the revisor said in a note attached to this bill that the rationest of many young practitioners in performing the most important surgical operations for the mere purpose of distinguishing themselves has been a subject of much complaint, and we are advised by old and experienced surgeons that the loss of life occasioned by the practice is alarming. And they're talking about all surgery in 1821. A doctor writing in 1867, this is long before Lister's work on antiseptic surgery had been performed, he said that when he began his work in 1876, Lister's discovery was in 1867. This was from 1876, Dr. Park. He said, when I began my work in 1876, in one of the largest hospitals of this country, it happened that during my first winter's experience, with but one or two exceptions, every patient operated on in that hospital, and that by men who were esteemed the peers of anyone of their day, every person died of blood poisoning, while I myself nearly perished from the same disease. This was in an absolutely new building, where expenditures had been lavished, one whose walls were not reeking with germs, as is the case yet in many of the old and well-established institutions. So what he's saying is that in the early parts of the last century, the risk for any medical care was very high. His experience of patients in the hospital where he worked was that there was a 100% mortality rate to anyone who submitted to the knife. So you can see why in 1828, expanding on this 1821 law, a law was drafted in New York State, which said, using some of this same terminology in 1821, that every person who shall administer to any pregnant woman or prescribe for any such woman or advise her to take any medicine, drug, substance, or whatever to produce a miscarriage shall be guilty of a felony. They gave no exceptions. Any person who did an abortion in the early 1820s and 30s was guilty of a felony because of the high death rate and the hazard to women that this kind of surgery entailed. A New Jersey state decision back in 1858 in reviewing why the laws were put on the books to limit abortion said, in a case which gives some contemporary judicial explanation of the legislative process, it said the design of the statute for abortion was not to prevent the procuring of abortions so much as to guard the health and life of the mother against the consequences of such attempts. It is immaterial whether the fetus is destroyed or whether it is quickened or not. In other words, in the early 1800s, the reason for putting the anti-abortion laws on the books was to protect the life of the women and not out of concern for the value of the fetus or embryo. And we think that this protection no longer is necessary, that the medical consequences of legal abortion are so safe now that no longer do we need a law like this on the books to protect the life of women submitting to this kind of surgery. The last statistics from New York show that the death rate from abortion is 3 per 100,000. To put that in medical perspective, the death rate from tonsillectomy is 17 per 100,000, and the death rate from circumcision is 3 per 100,000. So we no longer think that this law needs to be retained on the books because we can now protect the life of the women through adequate medical care. In Minnesota, our law was put on the books and copied directly word for this New York law in 1873. In fact, about 25 states did it all in a period from 1869 to 1873. And they did it at the urgings of a Protestant postmaster named Comstock. Have you ever heard of things called the Blue Laws? Do you know what they are? Comstock was concerned about immorality on college campuses. And so he went around the country and in a 2-year period got all the laws dealing with fornication, abortion, pornography, and censorship, adultery, put on the books. This, he said, would stamp out sex in college campuses. It's interesting that our even Minnesota law today punishes a woman who is found in these kinds of situations more severely than the man. A married man who has intercourse with a woman other than his wife is charged with fornication. A married woman who has intercourse with someone other than her husband is charged with adultery. Here again, you see a double standard. The men are given a much less punishment. If you are a woman brought to jail, for example, for some crime of a moral turpitude, so to speak, if you're suspected of being morally unfit, you are made to submit to a pap smear and to a study and examination to see if you might have venereal disease. You are retained in jail 1 extra day waiting for the results to come back from General Hospital. They do not do similar medical investigations of the males who happen to be arrested and put in jails in Hennepin County. So here, these are very small kinds of things, but it shows there still exists today some differences in the way males and females are treated by the laws and the police. In 1869, also the Catholic Church changed its position. Prior to 1869, they permitted abortions up to 40 days for a male embryo and 80 days for a female embryo. This was Aristotle's famous 40 and 80-day rule. Well, what's wrong with that? Aristotle didn't tell us how to separate the sexes from a fetus. And so in 1869, Pope Pius IX, in a flash from heaven that no one else seemed to hear, decided that abortion, sterilization, and birth control are all sins, and abortion cannot be permitted for any reason. As Eugene Quay, writing in a Catholic journal recently said, any woman who would not sacrifice her own life for that of her unborn child is herself not worthy to live. But a study of church history suggests that it wasn't a flash from heaven that may have caused Pope Pius to say this, but rather it was the urgings of Napoleon II, who felt that too many French women were self-aborting themselves, and this was going to affect the future population and recruitment of soldiers. And so it was Napoleon II who got Pope Pius to change his mind. The emphasis of this is that the church has had a zigzag path, and none of us can find anything in the Bible that says abortion, birth control, and sterilization are against God's will. In our own state, though, we have an organization that is trying to bring about a change in the law. To give you some idea of who backs repeal of the law in Minnesota, we find that the Minnesota Council of Churches, the American Baptist Convention, the American Lutheran Church, Church Council, the American Friends Service Committee, the Lutheran Church in America, Episcopal Church Women, Unitarian Association, Moravian Church, United Methodist Church of Minnesota, Church Women United Board of Managers, the American Public Health Association, the American Psychoanalytic Association, the American Psychological Association, the Minnesota Psychological Association, the National Council of Obstetrics and Gynecology, even the United Automobile Workers of America at their national convention without one dissenting vote called for repeal of the abortion law. The state DFL convention has it in their platform. Who is opposed to change? To my knowledge, 4 major groups in our state. And I ask you, can you think of who the organizations are that oppose change in our state? One group is called the Minnesota Citizens Concerned for Life. Another group is called the Abortion is Murder. Another group is the Soul Group, Save Our Unwanted Lives. And the fourth group, of course, the Roman Catholic Church. Now, in the last session of the legislature, there were attempts to tighten up the present law. While we were working to repeal the law, there was this other group working to tighten up the present law, spearheaded by Roger Scheer, a state representative from Brooklyn Center, Roger Scheer. He tried to introduce this amendment to the law, which was drafted by the Minnesota Citizens Concerned for Life, in which he tried to change the present penalty, which prescribes now that any woman who shall submit to an abortion shall get a 4-year prison sentence. Roger Scheer introduced it to say that any woman who shall cause an instrument to be used against her shall be guilty of a felony and punished by imprisonment in our state prison for not more than 10 years. Any woman who tries an abortion upon herself, or any person who tries to perform an abortion on her, shall also be guilty and subject to a prison sentence of not more than 10 years. The present prison sentence is 4 years. Another state legislator who is working to tighten up the present law is a young man named Warren Chamberlain from Faribault. He was joined by Charles Weaver from Anoka, by Fina, Quiernan, and Larson. Chamberlain introduced a bill called House File 879, which said that any person, corporation, or association who by any means counsels or advises any woman to remove herself from this state for the purposes of obtaining an abortion, or any woman who shall leave this state to go to Wisconsin for a legal abortion shall be guilty of a felony and upon conviction shall be sentenced to imprisonment for a period not to exceed 5 years or to be fined for not more than $5,000 or both. Representative Chamberlain wants to tighten up the present law and punish women who leave this state. As Representative DeGroat from Detroit Lake said, we should go out to that airport and find why those women are leaving the state and take them off those airplanes. Outrageous. This is the way some of our male legislators feel about the issue of women's rights. Chamberlain, Fina, Roger Scheer, Weaver. I think it's important to point out who it is that opposes change, who is opposed to women's rights in this state. Mecca came up with a very good concept calling them the Dirty Dozen, the 12 legislators who did the most to destroy the environment. I urge the women's groups in this state to make a list of the 10 most unwanted men in the legislature who oppose women's rights. Speaking of the state legislature, how many of you know how many of our 202 legislators are women? Does anybody know? We have 202 legislators. How many are women? I see our new state DFL chairwoman here, Corrine Horrible, may know. Corrine, why aren't there more women other than the one that's in there?
Lots of reasons. Lots of women have not run themselves. Are sitting back and trying to change that.
And what are you doing to bring about a change?
Well, we're conducting seminars all around the entire state, encouraging women to get involved in politics and not just doing the housework campaigns, but running and being a decision maker.
Good. And she serves as a great example of a woman involved in politics, the ranking Democrat woman in the state of Minnesota. Are you here for a program, Corrine, today too? Good. So I urge all of you, women particularly, to galvanize yourselves and don't sit back and let men continuing to dictate to you. I feel somewhat exposed as being a male involved in the abortion reform movement. I got involved in it because my wife is a physician, and we began a committee back in 1966 to change the law. And we had many people come and ask us what to do about problem pregnancies. And so, as an adjunct to an effort to change the law, we formed the Abortion Counseling Service of Minnesota. We tallied up the other day, we've seen 6,500 women in this state and sent them out of state for safe medical care. A graduate of this university is one of our full-time paid staff members, Paula Wendt. She's done a fine job. I happen to be the only male on the executive committee of the Minnesota Organized to Repeal the Abortion Laws, but there is a place for men too. So this is the main focus of our concern, that we can see nothing in the Constitution that should compel women who have unwanted pregnancies to go to term. I can see nothing in the Declaration of Independence that says every woman who gets pregnant shall go to term. It says very clearly that in the 14th Amendment, the Constitution applies to people who are born or naturalized. It says nothing to fetuses or embryos. The major objection to changing the abortion law, of course, has to do with this crucial issue of when does life begin. Does it begin at the moment of conception? Is abortion murder? There are some groups who believe that it is. The state law doesn't say so. Dr. Hodgson was given a 30-day jail sentence, so her judge must have not thought she committed murder. If abortion, or if conception is the moment of the beginning of life, then we must ask ourselves the question, what comes together at this moment? Do we have non-life coming together, forming life? No. We have living sperm and living egg coming together, which forms a new form of life. We don't create it at the moment of conception. Every one of you in this room have germ cells dating back 2.5 billion years. Our choice is not whether to create it, but whether to continue it or discontinue it. My medical advisors tell me that it takes 7 hours for that tiny sperm to penetrate the wall of the egg. At what time in this 7-hour span does life begin, so to speak? In the first 10 minutes? In the second half an hour? It's like saying how many angels can dance on the head of the pin. There are no such answers to these kinds of questions. So basically, the abortion question is a religious question. Those who oppose it need never have an abortion. But those who do not oppose it feel that the state should withdraw from this area and let every woman make her own choice as whether or not to continue with a pregnancy or not. Every woman in this room will have 400 opportunities to become a mother. And so many of us feel that you should have the right to choose at what point in this scale she should decide to become a mother. And as long as we support the birth control programs that we have, that women can limit fertility, regardless of what the rights of the unconceived people say, as long as we support birth control as public policy, and until we have a 100% birth control technique, then it seems incumbent upon us to permit women to correct birth control failures. Well, I've talked on a bit, and maybe some of you have some questions, some comments that you wish to make, and I welcome any comments from the floor some of you may have. Anybody have any responses or things that I haven't covered? Now, you can't all agree with me. I've brought some propaganda here that I'll leave with you. And I'll urge you to go to your party caucuses on February 22nd, in which resolutions calling for the repeal of abortion laws will be presented along with other resolutions. And it's important for you to be there, to have a say in the formulation of how these resolutions are handled. Anybody have any comments or questions or things I may not have covered? In the neighboring state of Wisconsin, the 3-judge federal panel struck down their law. It is now perfectly legal to go to Wisconsin for an abortion. I've not seen them start to raid their old folks' homes over there or kill off the veterans. Those who oppose us say there'll be a great moral decline, that it's the unborn today, it's the old folks tomorrow. We look at Japan and find that this has not occurred, where they've had no abortion laws for 22 years. If anything, they have a greater reverence for life, as the women of Japan decide for themselves whether or not they wish to continue with pregnancies that occur. Yes?
The women, if they go out of state, do they have to be established there for a certain amount of time?
In 6 of the states they do. In the state of Washington, where they repealed the law by referendum, the people voted, you have to be a resident of 90 days. The same in Alaska, Oregon, and Hawaii. But in California, Wisconsin, and New York State, there are no residency requirements. In New York, you have to be 18 or over or have parental consent. This is not required in California. In the state of Wisconsin, you must be 21. This simple device is the technique that is used to produce an abortion with a machine called a vacuum aspirator. The woman is given a local anesthetic in the cervix. This is inserted into the cervical opening. A vacuum device is turned on, and in 30 seconds it evacuates the contents of the uterus. This is the technique that's done in every state for pregnancies 11 weeks and under. Yes, this young man sitting down has his hand up. Would someone, I didn't hear you, maybe.
Women went to Wisconsin for an abortion.
Yes.
Could she, like, come back and
So far, no one has had to do that. We've had 2 women who went to Wisconsin who are underage who were arrested there. They have a requirement that you also be 18 or be 21 if you're not living away from home. There was a woman named Shirley Wheeler in Florida who went to New York for an abortion and who was arrested upon her return and convicted of breaking the Florida law. But so far, no woman who went to Wisconsin has been arrested. And when she got back to Minnesota, yes.
I think it's important to point out 2 things right now. About Shirley Wheeler, she's the only woman that was convicted of manslaughter for having an abortion. And they put her in jail on her return to Florida and showed her pictures of her so-called fetus, and they drove her absolutely almost crazy. But after she had her trial and she was put on probation, and she's a 23-year-old woman, they told her she had to live with her parents. And she has become really active in the abortion law repeal movement, has been working in the Women's National Abortion Action Coalition since then. Also, secondly, the New York law has been put under an injunction now by this man who has made himself guardian of the fetuses. And I'm not sure exactly, but abortions cannot be performed in municipal hospitals or private. I can't remember which. And this has just, been a really slap in the face to the abortion law repeal movement. Because New York was a place where most people were going for abortions. Could you comment on that a little bit?
Yes, the injunction was brought by Robert M. Byrne, professor of law at Fordham University. He is a Catholic and a bachelor. He filed suit to establish that the New York State abortion law is unconstitutional. He's been appointed guardian of all fetuses between 4 and 24 weeks by Professor Francis X. Xavier. Judge Francis X. Xavier, who was the judge who gave him this right. What he tried to get was a temporary injunction to prevent abortions in city hospitals. The state appealed and the injunction was stayed. At present, abortions are done in city hospitals, and this injunction is pending appeal by the state, and we think it will be struck down. But what it's done, it's focused, and it's really been good for the abortion movement to focus really the concern of many of us that there still are people in the wings who want to go back and strike down New York's great achievement. It's interesting that they're getting statistics now in New York State of the great drop in out-of-wedlock pregnancies. In the state of Washington, there's been a sharp decrease in requests for aid to dependent children payments from the Welfare Department. The drop in ADC in Washington State is so great that the governor was able to announce an increase in welfare benefits. Many people support abortion reform. Many of the people in our legislature support it for the wrong reasons. They see it as a way of reducing the welfare rolls. They see it's a dollar and cents thing. They don't see it as a woman's right. But we think the attack in New York State is very serious. And as a member of NARAL, the National Association to Repeal Abortion Laws, we've had several press conferences and issued statements condemning this. But they were able to defeat several of the pro-abortion legislators in New York. This is even more serious. They were able to redistrict. So many of those who sponsored the law no longer will be back in the legislature. And so we see this as a more serious thing as they reconvene to maybe strike the law down or limit it even further. Thank you for the comment. That is important. Any other comments, sir? Yes, sir.
I was wondering if you knew any other people, non-Catholic, or that weren't of any religion who were against abortion?
Yes, there are, of course, many people who are not Catholic who are opposing abortion.
Atheists, right?
I assume that there are many Unitarians, free thinkers, and others who are not traditional religiously oriented who oppose abortion, certainly. Some friendly priest sent me a copy of a statement by the Archbishop of Washington in which he said that the way to win the battle to defeat abortion reform is to form a front group of non-Catholics to do the front work for us and then follow it with Catholic action. And this is what's happened in our state, the Minnesota Citizens Concerned for Life. They've been to Washington State. I think they see how this program is run out there. And I'm leaving today for North Dakota. We're starting a referendum tomorrow. I'm speaking to the Kiwanis Club in Minot, North Dakota tomorrow. A referendum in North Dakota requires 8,000 signatures to put it on the ballot. And the people in North Dakota will get a chance to vote at the next election on repealing the abortion law. We think it'll pass. There it is the Catholic Church who are spearheading and fighting the change in the law. In our state it is, they spent substantial sums of money, but there is another organization that is doing much of the front work for them. Yes, sir.
I don't know if this is just a rumor or not, but somebody told me that the United Fund was putting out anti-abortion information as part of the money that it received.
Well, there's been an attack that United Fund is subsidizing agencies that are opposed to abortion. But they're also subsidizing the YWCA. And as you know, the gal who was giving sex education in our public schools got a lot of pressure and has been withdrawn from the public schools because she talked about abortion and birth control. So that those who oppose abortions are putting pressure on the United Fund to cut off support of the YW because they sponsor birth control and abortion information. I'm not aware of them giving any money to the anti-abortion programs. I may not be aware of any such things. Are you aware?
Well, I'm with the Minnesota Women's Abortion Action Coalition, and we have worked very closely with members of the YWCA on different things for women's liberation and abortion on repeal. And last October we were going to have a speak out on abortion, and we wanted to have it at the YWCA. And as much as they're in favor of it, the United Fund said that they couldn't, take that stand on it and have us there because they were against abortion, and they would cut off their funds if they went any further on it.
I didn't know that. What did you do about that?
We didn't have our speak out there. We didn't want to jeopardize their position.
I see.
For money, But a lot of the women there support it.
Marcia Bystrom is the really key person in this. She's been arrested and is going to be brought to trial for using four-letter words in a public school. And she needs community support, She talked to people in Lincoln High and other places in very earthy kinds of terms. And now she's being brought to trial for this. She's raising funds. She has to hire a lawyer. It's outrageous. 11% of the people we see are under the age of 17. The youngest we've ever seen is 12. I have a couple 13-year-olds now. What do you do with these people, It's a terrible thing. But yet there are many people who believe they make good mothers. The 12-year-old went to Hennepin County Hospital. We sent her there because she was raped. The guy who raped her was in jail. He admitted doing the rape. And we thought, well, surely if any case would be appealing, this would. They made her wait a month and wouldn't tell her, stalled around, fiddled around. Finally, they said, no, they won't do it. So we sent her to Ramsey County. It so happens the chief of obstetrics at Hennepin County, Dr. Freeman, is a board member of the Minnesota Citizens Concern for Life. Whether that had any effect on his medical judgment, I don't know. But he did threaten Ramsey County, if you do this abortion, you'll be breaking state law, so they didn't do it. But one of the caseworkers at Hennepin County was so distressed about this that she gave out of her own pocket the airfare for the mother to accompany her 12-year-old daughter. We raised the medical fee and her transportation for the 12-year-old to go to California. What kind of social disorganization does this bring about? We've had 4 deaths in the last 16 months in Minnesota. The Snow Queen of Bemidji State College was killed by an amateur abortionist last year who inserted a metal rod into her cervix, pumped air into her uterus, and killed her within 3 minutes. A girl from St. Paul talked her sister, the girl was 23, talked her sister into doing an abortion on her. The sister took a welding rod and put it over a catheter, inserted it into her uterus, perforating it. She didn't intend to do that. The girl got a serious infection and in a week died. Her sister was indicted by the St. Paul grand jury, and she promptly committed suicide. Now, what kind of social disorganization do we bring about in setting up such conditions as this? Women will get abortions whether the law says yes or no. We know this. The present law has no effect on the number of abortions that are done. It simply guarantees they're going to a non-medical setting. 23% of all women by the time they are 45 will have had an abortion. 23%. Kinsey discovered this many years ago in going around asking 20,000 women. He astonished the medical community. The opposition says you can't verify this. But Hawaii is verifying it because they're doing 10.6 abortions every day in Hawaii, which happens to be 20% of the conceptions that occur in Hawaii every day, exclusive of tourists that may be visiting there. Formerly, women from Hawaii went to Mexico City or Tokyo, Japan. The death rate from criminal abortion in our country still runs from 400 to 600 every year. We saw the case of where I mentioned 4 here. There are still 4 amateur abortionists operating in the Twin Cities. There used to be 6. We got 2 of them arrested. I wish the opposition would spend more time doing those kinds of things. You had a comment.
How do you hope to change it by something like a referendum or what?
No, in our state there is no provision for a referendum. You can have it, but it's just an advisory vote to the legislature. It has no binding message at all. We could have a constitutional question on the ballot. but it's very tough to phrase this kind of an issue in constitutional matters. So it's nothing we can do in our state. In Michigan, they're having a referendum. They need 300,000 signatures to put it on the ballot. They've have half of them already. And so they appear to be able to overcome. It's been defeated, the Michigan legislature, repeatedly. They jumped the gun this weekend in Fargo. They've started the great campaign, and they're really excited about how people signed the referendum to get it on the ballot. So our hope here is, one, redistricting, getting the farm, what would you say, the over representation that rural Minnesota has away from them and transferred more to the population centers. That's why Corinne's efforts in women's action and these kinds of things throughout the state, really of both political parties, is an important cornerstone in this issue of giving women political moxie. At the meeting that was held on Saturday, apparently the opposition packed the meeting and tried to defeat their efforts to repeal the abortion law. It failed. Were any of you there at that meeting? Maybe you can comment on some of these things. Yes.
They call themselves Women for Universal Human Rights. Which is, you can tell that sounds like a nice name. It sounds like it's for civil rights or something like that. And they packed the meeting, and in the first hour, a lot of the women there were concerned about, if the candidates would state their position on abortion. And each candidate was supposed to have 1 minute to talk about themselves. And then the motion was brought up to say if they could have 1 minute of questions to question people on their positions on things. And they almost voted that down. And it just was a big runaround. And it was really clear that they'll do anything, to try and stop the movement to repeal abortion laws. And also on the campus, they have the University of Minnesota campus. They have a group, Save Our Unwanted Lives, and they follow the women and women's liberation around. This one little guy, and he's always yelling at us and stuff. He called me a dumb broad in the daily. And they have so much money, they can put out more things than like different groups that are for repeal of the abortion laws. And it makes it clear to me that they're going to pack meetings. That's going to be an ongoing characteristic of our movement to repeal those laws. But they're going to be right behind us, donating and so on.
Yes.
I was at that meeting on Saturday too, and I was one of those who voted with the people concerned for life. Now, it isn't that I wouldn't be in favor of repealing Minnesota law, but I think both sides on this question take very extreme positions, and in terms that I can't support. And I wish that all the pro-abortion people would make as much sense as God would point us, but they don't. But some of their leaders, I felt, were very, how should I say, were rather broad-minded at the meeting on Saturday, and should be given, I think, credit for statements like leadership. It isn't, as simple an issue as either side makes it clear to me.
That's a good point. And I'm not here to sell abortion. I'm here to sell the idea of giving women a free choice. This is, unfortunately, that we've polarized into two groups, and there's not much dialogue between the two of us. We have debates occasionally, but there's more heat than light. Well, I've talked for way too long. I don't know how long your program runs here. What do you have to say, Madam Chairman? Okay, fine. Well, thank you for your attention. What we need is a group of students here in Augsburg to form a counterbalancing group to the SOUL group, or the Minnesota Citizens Concerned for Life group. So if some of you have an interest in that, there are a group of college students who are organizing throughout the state. The opposition has 100 chapters. Every parish has somebody almost full-time involved in cranking out mail. Most of us are multiple-issue people. We're concerned with abortion reform, but we're also concerned with other things. The opposition is singly minded to fight abortion reform. And nothing's going to happen unless you become galvanized and respond and do something. Well, those are my parting remarks. And if I say any more, there's some propaganda here. You can help yourselves, but do something about it. Don't take what I say as the gospel truth until you've looked it out and studied it yourself. Well, thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Bob McCoy for coming in. Also, right now, back here in the Red Lounge, we're having a panel discussion dealing with women in politics. And the woman that Bob McCoy was just talking to, she's a member of the panel. Mrs. Sibley is going to be moderating it, and I hope that you all come back and listen for a while. It's right in back of us here.